Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour with Dr. Kiki Sanford, episode number 81, recorded on Thursday, January 27th, 2011. The Bad Science Hour. This episode of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is brought to you by MailRoute.com. Businesses of every size use MailRoute, from 1 employee to 50,000. It doesn't matter. MailRoute will protect you from spam and viruses, simplify your life, and make your email usable again. Go to mailroute.info for information. Welcome, everybody. It is another episode of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. I'm Dr. Kiki Sanford, and we're ready. I'm ready. I'm ready to get down and dirty with some bad science. That's right. Today we're talking about bad science. What is bad science? Well, to talk with us today about this idea of badness, the badness that science can sometimes include, or at least what people's perceptions of science can be and what they include in the name of science. Those are my own quotations added, is Ben Goldacre. He is, according to his own website, an award-winning writer, broadcaster, and medical doctor who specializes in unpicking dodgy scientific claims made by scaremongering journalists, dodgy government reports, evil pharmaceutical corporations, PR companies, and quacks. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining me on the show, Dr. Goldacre.
Hey, hi.
Hi, it's good to see you. Could you give us a definition? What encompasses bad science?
So, I guess bad science is kind of all science, because all science is about criticizing the evidence for somebody's claims. So what I do in kind of unpicking and critically appraising the evidence behind claims in popular culture in the book and in the column and on the website is basically what happens in academia normally. If you read any academic journal, it's people tearing strips off each other's ideas. If you look at, if you go to any academic conference, you know, the Q&A session after a presentation is often a bloodbath. You know, people tear strips off each other, but it's not considered impolite or rude. It's like a kind of consenting intellectual S&M. So all of science is about critically appraising the evidence for the other person's position. And so in doing that with claims from popular culture, I'm trying to narrativize the empirical process for a popular audience. But also the book specifically, or this book anyway, it's basically kind of an epidemiology textbook. It's a medical stats textbook, but dressed up through the medium of examples of where people have got stuff wrong.
And you've been writing about this, not necessarily just in the for this book, Bad Science, but for your title, your column in The Guardian as well, also titled Bad Science, for years. Do you find that there's much of, I guess over the years, that there's been much of a change in people's acceptance of the facts that you put forward, picking apart people's claims?
So I suppose, I guess it's different in different territories, because different fads and different scares happen at different times in different places. The best example of this, I suppose, is vaccine scares, because vaccine scares they're cultural phenomena. They're not about the evidence. They're usually built on kind of wider political, social, cultural, and personal issues. So, for example, we had our big anti-MMR, anti-vaccine scare in the UK in 2002 is when it peaked, and then it kind of dwindled over the last few years. Whereas I think the high watermark for your anti-vaccine scare in America, that was built much more around mercury preservative in vaccines, that kind of peaked in about 2008, I'd say. Meanwhile, if you went to like France or Germany, they've basically never heard of anti-MMR vaccine scares. But in France, in the late 1990s, they had this huge scare that the hepatitis B vaccine caused multiple sclerosis. And if you go and talk about MMR there, as I have, they say, well, what do you mean? MMR is fine. Nobody ever thought MMR was bad. Hepatitis B vaccine, that's the one you want to worry about. Haven't you been reading the papers? Apparently it causes multiple sclerosis. Yeah. So you get these different fads happening in different places at different times. And I'm not convinced that people have ever been kind of more or less gullible or foolish. I guess I've been a little bit lucky in the UK in that the book sold like 250,000 copies here, which means that there are a lot more people out there who, if somebody starts wittering on about homeopathy or chiropractic or something like that at a dinner party, the probability that somebody there will have the sort of intellectual tools to challenge them is maybe a little bit fractionally higher for a very brief period of time, maybe.
Maybe. There's a little bit of speculation there. I know from personal experience here in the United States, I think it's often a politeness thing as well. You don't really in company, you're not really going to step out and challenge somebody else's beliefs, or you don't want to make a nuisance, or you don't want to cause a scene necessarily.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's it. There are really interesting parallels there between people's faith in alternative therapies and people's faith in religion. It is one of those things where I think people just believe they believe that vaccines are dangerous so powerfully. They believe that their homeopathy sugar pills really do sort of treat their headaches or whatever so powerfully that. You're absolutely right. To challenge that at all is considered crass. And what's particularly interesting about that is it means that these ideas are kind of policed. They're kind of walled off from criticism. And you see this replicated over and over again with all forms of dodgy science. Yeah. You see that people will create barriers to people critically appraising their ideas. So they will use the law, for example. They'll threaten you with libel cases, which has happened to me in the UK, just to stop you from criticising their ideas. And it's happened to many other people in the UK, both pharmaceutical companies and kind of alternative therapists. It's policed with politeness, as you say. In universities, we have a particular problem here, which I think is much more extreme in the UK than anywhere else. And I haven't really got to the bottom of why we're so susceptible to it, but in universities in the UK, there are lots of universities giving out like science degrees in things like homeopathy, and they're not teaching it critically, they're teaching it very kind of credulously. And what you see again is that the faculty who are teaching the evidence base for the alternative therapies will be completely and utterly walled off from the departments there in the same institutions that are teaching medical students and nursing students and dental students and everybody else who needs to know about evidence-based medicine and the basic science of how do you know if something works or not. You'll find that they're completely walled off. And if anybody from the evidence-based medicine department raises any complaints about the alternative therapy department, there's this kind of, embarrassment and shuffling and fumbling, and it leads to absolutely bizarre situations where me and a friend of mine called Professor David Colhoun, who runs a fantastic blog, dcscience.net, have gone through endless hoops of trying to ring up these universities' press offices, doing Freedom of Information Act requests, just to find out even what they teach on their courses, and they won't tell you. They won't even tell you what they're teaching on their courses. So then you get leaks of what they're teaching, and it's crazy, made up nonsense. So yeah, it's really interesting to me how bad ideas are policed and protected from any scrutiny in so many different ways.
Here, it's not that the degrees like homeopathy are not given out by major universities, accredited universities at least. There are private institutions that will that are homeopathy schools that have programs in homeopathy that will give you a degree or something. But I think it's on the part of the consumer, there's little ability, or I guess the consumer doesn't take the time to discern between what is a degree from accredited institution versus a degree from, the Homeopathy Institute of San Francisco, for example.
So I guess that's probably kind of true, but I take quite a hard and I think unfashionable line on this, which is I'm not a consumer journalist. I'm not like here to protect people or stop them being ripped off. And I actually don't care if people get ripped off. I'm very happy to view that as a kind of voluntary, self-administered tax on scientific ignorance. Okay. I'm interested in communicating about the basic ideas of evidence-based medicine, because I think the basic science of how we know if something is good for us or bad for us, the way that you can tell the difference between a fair test of a treatment and a dodgy one that is bound to give you false positive results and so on, is really interesting. I think that obvious quacks, obviously ripping obviously gullible people off, actually isn't so interesting to me. And also I really struggle with the idea that it seems to me that so many of these people are so obviously quacks that the risk factors are as much in the person who's handing over the money as they are in the person who's trying to take the money off them. In the words of Withnail from Withnail and I, which is a great film, which obviously nobody in America has seen probably. But in the words of Withnail from Withnail and I, these aren't accidents. They're throwing themselves willingly into the road. I don't really see this as a consumer issue. I think it's really interesting that there are so many people who they don't just sort of believe quacks passively; they actively seek them out.
Yeah,
and I think that tells you so much about the role of medicine in society and in our culture. And I think you lose all of the richness of that if you kind of set it up as a kind of exploiter and victim model. I think it's just much more interesting than that.
I think you're probably right. I think there is probably a bit more to it, and it does come into the actual seeking of a certain type of information. A person has a certain worldview, and they're going to seek the information that will perpetuate that worldview. I'd like to go back to go ahead. What were you going to say?
No, I mean, it's the sort of thing that you could speculate on endlessly, I suppose.
Endlessly,
yeah. Right now, I'm just finishing the next book, which is on crimes in the pharmaceutical industry, which is something that I touch on a lot in the column, and there's quite a lot of it in the book as well. Mainly because, it seems to me that quacks and big pharma are both playing exactly the same game. You couldn't put a cigarette paper between them. They're both using tricks. They're both distorting evidence in order to sell people their pills. And big pharma uses slightly more sophisticated techniques for misrepresenting evidence, but it's all basically exactly the same stuff. And what I think is really interesting is Big Pharma has done some really dreadful things over the last couple of decades. It's very badly regulated, and it's quite a complicated story how they've gone about distorting evidence and how they've gone about sidestepping regulators and so on. And I think a lot of the popularity of kind of quack medicine is a sort of poetic response to what are very obvious and serious problems in Big Pharma. And what's interesting about them is they're not very sort of satisfactory responses, but they are nonetheless, they have the kind of the poetic structure, the shape of response. I mean, certainly all the quacks have this kind of fantasy that they are fighting against Big Pharma. Even the ones who actually work for subsidiaries of big pharmaceutical companies selling vitamin pills really do sort of pretend that they are big campaigns against Big Pharma. And I think there's something interesting about the way that people will set up a kind of poetic narrative about alternative therapies that basically goes, Big Pharma, these companies withheld evidence that Vioxx was bad for you. They withhold data showing that their drugs are bad. They withhold data showing that their drugs are less effective than placebo or whatever. Therefore, vitamin pills cure cancer. Big Pharma is evil, therefore vaccines cause autism, and it's a big conspiracy. And I think actually the biggest tragedy of that is that they are crap responses to these serious regulatory problems with the pharmaceutical industry, and they act as a kind of distraction from the real problems. But anyway, sorry, I mean, that was a ridiculous diversion. It's about 5 a.m. for me, obviously, so I will become more incoherent as time passes.
I'm looking forward to it. It'll just make the interview more interesting. But the tangent to in the discussion of big pharma, I think, is really pertinent to this. And if you can't trust what the corporations, the organizations that are out there that you're supposed to trust, who do you trust? What do you trust? And how do you discern what is trustworthy?
So that's interesting. I mean, to me, of all the different ways that you can unpick whether a scientific claim is true or not, trust is probably the least interesting. It's because it's the least technical, and trust is so. I'm hearing strange noises. Trust is kind of the most easily manipulable. You can manipulate trust by having some fake PhDs and a nice suit, and a plausible office, and all of that kind of stuff. But once you start getting into the sort of finer details of it, you stumble into more interesting stuff. Like, for example, people kind of trying to use the jargon of science in order to adopt the cloak of scientific respectability or authority.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was really surprised to find is, I mean, how kind of PhD students and postdocs often do kind of fun experiments in their spare time in between their proper work. There's actually been a huge amount of research around kind of experimental psychology of how to manipulate people's beliefs. There's a
Yes.
gigantic science for rationality, but there's also quite a lot of quite good stuff that's being done on marketing, and there's stuff that's been done on sciencey sounding jargon. And we know that if you use kind of spurious scientific words to dress up an assertion that you're making, it's scored much more credibly by the audience. And I don't know, maybe that's kind of trivial and obvious, but I think it's sort of interesting.
I think it's a really interesting, an important point. I mean, that somebody in the chat room was asking, why am I assuming that trust is important? Why do people have to trust? And why trust? Why should anyone trust an organization? Well, it's human nature to trust you and to get information from other individuals, from other sources. And we are a social species. And so if we want to talk about the psychological side of this, I think trust is one of the most important parts of the argument of what anyone is putting together. So the scientist who toils in the lab, who does empirical tests, who comes out with data and has information and uses big words to explain things, you trust what they say because they do work that you're supposed that you should believe in. Whether or not belief should be part of science, belief isn't part of science, but it's part of what people do. So, how do we bring all of these points together, trust, belief, science, so that quacks are less capable of using it to their advantage?
So I guess one interesting problem here is if your end goal is to convince people of stuff, then you might use different tools and manipulate trust. You might use different tools to the tools of popular science. So it's not my job to make people trust scientists about vaccine. I write about vaccine scares because I think they're really fascinating social phenomena. They're a great opportunity to talk to people about case control studies and prospective cohort studies, which is how you know if something is dangerous for a population. But I'm not trying to convince people that a vaccine is safe. And actually, a lot of the evidence, particularly if you look at the natural history of the latest vaccine scare in the UK, the MMR scare, the natural history of that actually shows you that it wasn't the science what won it. It was other stuff, and other stuff which kind of isn't my shtick, but which is, other people's, and it's fine. So in the UK in 1998, this guy, Andrew Wakefield, who's now been shown to be, to have dishonestly misrepresented his results and conducted experiments on children with learning difficulties without ethics committee clearance and done all kinds of dreadful things.
Committed
and he had
fraud.
Competing and had competing interests and got like £500,000 from legal aid to produce a case against the vaccine and so on. But what's really interesting is in 2002, we already had the evidence showing that there wasn't a relationship between MMR and autism. So there was, for example, an enormous study by Madsen et al. In Denmark, which looked at 500,000 children, and 450,000 kids had the MMR vaccine and 100,000 kids did not have the MMR vaccine. And they followed them up and they found that the rates of autism were exactly the same in both groups. So this is kind of very compelling, huge sample size evidence that there's no relationship between MMR and autism. And there are similar studies to that. There's a big case control study where they took 1,000 people with autism and 1,000 people without autism and then went back and compared the rates of whether or not they'd had the MMR vaccine earlier on in their lives and found that there was no association between MMR and autism. But that didn't convince anybody. The science didn't win that argument. The turning point in the natural history of the MMR scare in the UK was in 2004 when an investigative journalist called Brian Deere produced some pieces in the Sunday Times showing that Andrew Wakefield had financial competing interest, that he'd made £500,000. And it was in 2004 that the vaccine uptake ticked up again and started to increase. So it dropped from 92% down to about 80% and as low as 60% in some parts of the UK. But it was after the exposure of Andrew Wakefield's character rather than his science, that people started to trust in the vaccine again. And to me, that kind of shows that it's often not science that wins these things, and that's kind of what politicians know, and that's what PR people know. It's rhetoric and it's engineering culture and it's PR that shifts people's behaviour. And that's fine, but that's somebody else's game, not mine.
So in terms of your game, let's talk about vaccines for a second. There's an interesting comment in the chat room, and I don't know if you have a similar conversations in the UK, but someone just brought up the question about fake flu shots, with this fake flu shot with fake flu shots being heavily promoted every year to fight some non-existent plague. How are we supposed to trust any of the other vaccines either? And I honestly, I don't think there are any fake flu shots, and I haven't heard of any fake flu shots being produced. The flu shot is to combat the flu, which changes in its genotype every year.
Yeah, is that referencing a specific American news story about fake sort of wrongly manufactured flu vaccines, or is this somebody saying there was no flu problem, there was no new strain of flu, and the vaccine doesn't work?
I think that's the question. Although I have heard people bring up with the bird flu a couple of, I guess last year, the bird flu, we eventually got a bird flu, the H1N1 vaccine that was promoted by our government, that everyone should take the bird flu vaccine in addition to the yearly flu shot. So, but then the bird flu never happened. And so people think of it as, should I have gotten something? Is it less or more dangerous to trust this new flu shot that has never been given out before?
So the flu vaccine isn't something that I've looked at particularly, mainly because there wasn't a big panic about it in the UK, so there wasn't kind of any, there wasn't enough lunacy for me to go and dig through all of the evidence. But the new strain of flu, the swine flu, is now kind of just one of the normal, commonplace circulating strains of flu in the UK this year. So
get your flu shot, people. I think the question also is whether or not, or I guess how much a vaccine should be promoted by the government, in the sense of we have a new, if there's a new, say, SARS or the bird flu or some new disease that pops up, we're able to come up with a vaccine for it. Should the government enforce mandatory vaccinations? And how should we tell the public about it?
Yeah, I'm not really into governments forcing stuff on people. So, I think it would have to be a pretty extreme public health emergency, on the level of quarantining people before you kind of buy into that. And I can't imagine it going down very well in America. Whenever I've gone to America, I've always met fabulous, libertarians who are awesome, who genuinely have a basement full of baked beans and rifles. So I guess that would be an even bigger ask in America. But I'm not sure that's something that anybody is particularly suggesting. So vaccines are a really interesting medical intervention and have always traditionally triggered anxiety for a number of reasons. Firstly, they're not very nice to get, so you're kind of primed to find them anxiety-provoking and weird. It hurts when you get injected with them, and also you get it when you're not unwell. It's preventive, and that's kind of, that sort of doesn't make sense. The profit and loss isn't so obvious, I guess, if you're having an intervention while you're still well. And what's also interesting is that the scares go back right to the beginning of vaccination. So people were running kind of anti-vaccine campaigns in the 19th century that have exactly the same structure as the vaccine scares that we have right now today, and absolutely exactly the same. You see people making arguments like, why do we need smallpox vaccination? We haven't had any smallpox in this village for 2 years. And then they have a big protest and stop having the smallpox, and everybody gets smallpox in the next few years. Sorry, I can't remember what we were talking about. It's about 7 in the morning now.
It keeps getting later and later.
It's strange, isn't it? It's the delay on the line that's dilated.
Well, we can move on. We can move off of the vaccine subject also, and maybe talk a little bit more about Big Pharma. And I know Big Pharma is something that's a major topic in your book. So, have you seen much of a difference in the way that Big Pharma works in the UK versus how it's integrated itself in the United States? I know here we have lobbyists who end up pushing for certain drugs to be accepted by the Federal Drug Administration. So there are big questions about the regulation of drugs, about how drugs are being brought to market here in the United States. I don't know exactly if it's if it's the same environment in the UK.
Yeah, you get exactly the same thing, and obviously, a lot of territories take their lead from America and from the FDA. I think your FDA are certainly more transparent than the MHRA and the European Medicines Regulator, and I'll give you a couple of interesting examples of that in a moment. Although it's also fair to say, I think that the FDA kind of engages in a little bit of what you might call sort of transparency theatre. So they have some of their sort of regulatory affairs discussions in public, very sort of flamboyantly, but then they also have lots of them in secret. The lobbying stuff, I think, so that kind of happens everywhere. But the thing that I think is really, really interesting, again, is the science more than the politics. So In medicine, there is this kind of dark scandal at the absolute core of everything that we do, which is drug companies can do a whole bunch of trials, and they get to choose which ones they publish, and they get to choose how they publish them. And time and time again, what you see is that drug companies will selectively choose not to publish the trials which show that their drug wasn't better than the competitor. Right. Or you find that they choose not to publish the trials showing that their drug had worse side effects. And this is a problem that's been going on forever, really. I mean, for as long as there's been a pharmaceutical industry. And people have tried so hard to try and introduce solutions, but the only people who haven't introduced solutions that they've fully implemented are governments, and it's a job that can only be done by a government. So one thing that we tried doing was having a clinical trials register. So what a clinical trials register means is before you do your trial, you write down what you're going to do, where you're going to do it, who you're going to recruit, what treatments you're going to give them, in each of the two arms of your randomized trial, and then what you're going to measure as your primary outcome. And this means that people can go back, they can look at the published record of what's appeared in the academic journals, and they can say, well, I can see that these 3 trials have completed and been published, but what about these other 2 that you did? You know, you registered them and you've done them, and they're finished now according to the dates that you projected you'd be doing all this in. So where are the results? And that was the idea. But the problem is, it wasn't policed by anybody. Like, it is literally, you know, it was nobody's job to check that they've been published. So people were, we imagined that this kind of process outcome was actually the real concrete outcome. So then the International Collaboration of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJ, which is a kind of informal group of academic journal editors, got together and they said, okay, we're gonna not take any more trials and for publication in our academic journals unless they've been registered before they started, because there was a real problem that companies were continuing to run trials but not even bother to register them on these big trials registers. So the idea was that, you know, the medical journals of the world would say, well, we're not going to publish your stuff unless you've pre-registered it. So that means registering it will effectively become compulsory. But that didn't work because they didn't stick to their word. There's a paper by Doug Altman and colleagues that I wrote about last year where they went through every single trial written up in the top 10 medical journals from the 5 biggest fields of medicine, you know, GI, respiratory, and so on. And they found that about half of all the trials weren't properly registered before they started. So the whole story of the regulation of this incredibly destructive bad behavior in medicine is one of these kind of ad hoc, often quite amateurish attempts to police it in a kind of piecemeal fashion that don't work, but which allow people to brush you off and to say, oh no, it's fine, we've dealt with that now, you know, we've got on top of that, you know, the ICMJ, it's impossible now to get published unless you pre-registered your trial. And that's what I've been told by, you know, very senior people. Vincent Lawton from the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority in the UK sort of pulled that line out on me in a very rushed Radio 4, like BBC interview last year. And I think these kind of non-solutions to the problem are actually almost more destructive than no solution at all. And it's important to remember that, you know, in medicine we can only choose which treatment is best for a patient on the basis of the published literature. And if people selectively withhold unflattering data from the scientific literature, then as doctors and as patients, when we make decisions together about what is the most effective treatment for a particular problem, we're doing it with misleading data. And as a result of that, we make the wrong decision. We make decisions which expose patients to unnecessary harm, unnecessary risk, and unnecessary death. And it's a difficult sell to a news media who want very simple, direct stories about, you know, there's this one drug that's a killer. it's a much more difficult sell to say, well, look, there's this quite complex piece of regulatory failure. To fully understand it requires that you understand the basics of the whole of evidence-based medicine, but the end product is that people die. But it's not people that you can go and like find their grieving relative and say, this person definitely died because the evidence was distorted overall. It's a bit more complicated than that. It's that if you take 1 million people who are at risk of a heart attack and you treat them with the drug that looked like it was the most effective one, then you should have prevented 100,000 unnecessary deaths, but actually you only prevented 80,000 unnecessary deaths. So you've got a gap of 20,000. Mm-hmm. But how do you identify those 20,000 people? You kind of can't. These are sort of statistical deaths. They're not people with grieving relatives. So it's a little bit trickier to push, I guess.
Unfortunately, I have to take a short break to this conversation to say thank you to our sponsor. So if you'll hold on for just one moment.
Fair enough.
One moment.
Who's your sponsor? Is it Merck?
Yes.
GSK?
Yes. Pharma.
Wow, I
Big
knew
Pharma.
it.
Exactly.
I knew it.
No, actually, our sponsor is mailroute.info. Mailroute.info. I'd like to thank them very much for sponsoring this hour of Dr. Kiki Science Hour. It's a secure, hosted service that filters virus and spam for companies of any size. Individuals too. You don't have to have a company. You can just be yourself and sign up for MailRoute service and have virus and spam filtered from your email inbox. Those email inboxes that you have thrown away, thought unusable, made completely inaccessible by viruses and spam. Well, good news for you is that you can port them right through MailRoute, and their service will get rid of all those nasty buggers for you and make your email usable again. So whether you are an individual, whether you are a company of 50,000, MailRoute can actually help you out a lot. And Leo here at the Twit Network and Tom have both used the service. They both say that they have been helped out a lot by MailRoute. And there is a great service for Twit listeners. There's a special offer for you. If you sign up as a Twit listener, go to mailroute.info. You'll receive a 10% discount for the life of your account. That's pretty good. Not just a limited time offer, it's for the life of your account. So small business accounts start at $2 per month per user for 10 users. And because of demand for the individual single user account, MailRoute has added a new service just for you as well. And that starts at less than $30 per year. Visit mailroute.info and sign up with the email filtering service that Tom and Leo use. Thank you very much, MailRoute, for sponsoring this hour of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. Now back to the programming. We're speaking with Dr. Ben Goldacre about bad science. And his book, Bad Science, is available here in the United States. You can buy it in the old paper version, where if you like the tactile thing. You can also buy it online. It's available online, digital formats. We were talking about bad pharma, big pharma before we came into the break. I'm looking at the comments that people are making in the chat room, and it's just amazing to me the very anti-pharmaceutical commentary that's just passing by very quickly. A lot of just. Lack of trust, I guess. A lot of lack of trust, lack of acceptance of the capitalistic ideals to help us. However, there are individuals in the chat room who have said, thank you. I get good drugs from the pharmaceutical companies. There are drugs out there that help me. So there's good stuff that comes out of it. So the conversation that we were having, Dr. Goldacre, is... you were talking about the fact that that pharmaceutical companies have been, just not giving out information. They're hiding stuff. They're not as transparent as we would like them to be, but they have that right because they're corporations. However, they have an influence on medicine and the doctors who are prescribing drugs, who are treating patients, and then on the patients themselves and their health and their well-being. Should there be some kind of, you mentioned several methods that have been tried and failed to bring these pharma corporations to greater transparency, but do you think there is any way that we can actually get them to give all that information out, make people safer?
Yeah, you just have to make them do it with laws, and then you have to enforce those laws. I mean, I know that in America you're big fans of slender government, but this is one area where you can't muck about. And actually, so one of the really interesting things about this is it's not as if the products of big pharma are kind of inherently evil. I mean, there is no medicine without medicines. It's amazing when you think about it that an industry that has produced so much amazing sort of life-saving technology in the form of so many different medical treatments and devices and pills has managed to corner itself into having such an atrocious, deservedly awful reputation. And it's got sort of important ramifications as well for collaboration, because I think that, doctors and academics today they look slightly embarrassed and ashamed if they say that they're working on a project with a big pharmaceutical company. And actually, I think that doctors and academics should be able to feel ambitious and optimistic about collaborating with big pharma. But that requires that there are well-policed regulatory frameworks laid down that mean that big pharma cannot selectively hide unflattering data. And until you get that, I don't think it's really kind of safe, unless you've got things absolutely nailed down in your contract that you're allowed to publish independently and so on. I don't think it's really safe to collaborate, and that's kind of my view at the moment. But I certainly don't think that big pharma is sort of inherently and unfixably evil and dreadful. And in a lot of respects, actually sort of bad regulation, such as what we've seen over the past few decades of the pharmaceutical industry, results in these quite paradoxical incentives for companies to outwit and outcompete each other by hiding data. But it's probably a zero-sum game, and actually overall, they all kind of have to do it because the others are doing it. But I'm not entirely convinced that they would be any worse off in an environment where it was properly policed.
I'd like to shift gears for a second, and not for a second, for maybe the duration of the show. Shift gears and talk about homeopathy for a little while. Homeopathy is an alternative treatment structure that many people adhere to. The idea behind homeopathy is dilution, where oftentimes compounds that actually are quite toxic for you are diluted down to 1 part in 1 million parts of water, but diluted down so drastically that you're drinking water or taking a sugar pill if you are taking a homeopathic treatment. In the UK, there have been several organized moments against homeopathy, especially in your pharmacies, where I think I read something in this last year, 2010, people came out and protested against one of the major pharmacies in the UK actually carrying homeopathic treatments. So could you talk a little bit about homeopathy and the movement against it in the UK?
Yeah, so homeopathy is I mean, it's obviously absurd, right? It's the idea is that you take an ingredient which makes you sick. So you take something which makes you nauseous, and then you dilute it down, and you dilute it down so much that there are no molecules left in the very highly diluted solution that you've made, and then you give this to treat nausea instead of cause nausea. So there are two problems with that. Firstly, it's not plausible. The dilutions are so big that the typical homeopathy dilution is 1 drop of the original ingredient in 100 drops of water, and you shake that about. You take 1 drop of that solution and put that in 100 drops of water and shake that about. And you take 1 drop of that and put that in 100 drops of water and shake that about.
And then you do the hokey pokey and you turn yourself around.
Exactly. And then you have to do the hokey pokey 30 times. And by the time you've done this, you create a solution which is so dilute that it's roughly the same as 1 molecule of the original substance in a sphere of water whose diameter is roughly the same as a sphere of water whose diameter is roughly the same as here where I am in London to the edge of the sun. And that's not an exaggeration. This is what homeopaths actually believe. And actually, oh man, there's someone calling me over and over again, and I think it's a strange random person from the internet. Seriously, I think it's one of you. Anyway, hello, Baha Effendi. Yeah, and actually, I wrote about this ridiculous, the dilution thing, which is just so obviously absurd that it just makes homeopaths look pretty dumb. And the homeopath actually complained about me to the Press Complaints Commission, took it as far as he possibly could.
Yeah.
And he said, Dr. Goldacre explained the dilution in homeopathy, but he deliberately did not tell you that at each step in between the dilution, we take the flask of water and strike it 6 times firmly against a leather surface overlaid on horsehair. And it's this that makes the water remember the molecules that were dissolved in it. And because he did not mention this, Dr. Goldacre deliberately made us look stupid, which goes to show how far you can disappear into your strange belief system. But the most important thing about homeopathy really is, regardless of whether it's plausible or not, I mean, we don't know how anesthetics work, okay, but we know that they do work. I've done operations on people while they were knocked out by anesthetics. I don't know how those anesthetic works,
right.
but I do know that they do work. With homeopathy pills, we know that they don't work. So you do a trial, you run a trial, and a trial is the simplest thing in the world to do. You take 200 people who've got a particular health problem that they're going to see a homeopath about. Maybe it's headaches, maybe it's nausea, maybe it's aching joints, whatever. And you split them in half. And they all see the homeopath, and they all get prescribed the homeopath's individual prescription for exactly what they think you need. It's not even that you're all getting the same kind of homeopathy pill. You can have any kind of homeopathy pill that the homeopath wants to prescribe to you. And then just as you go to hand in your prescription, half of the patients get their homeopathy sugar pills, the ones that have been prepared in the magical ritual with the dripping and the drops and the dilution and the shaking and the bashing against the horsehair. Half of them get the real genuine magical homeopathy sugar pills, and half of them just get plain old sugar pills that look exactly the same, but you can't tell the difference between them. And what you find is when you do that, the people on the homeopathy sugar pills don't get better any faster or any slower than the people just getting the plain old dummy sugar pills. So homeopathy doesn't work any better than placebo.
Right. If you do that test and you have people who don't do anything, people who take dummy sugar pills and people who take homeopathic sugar pills, you can see a slight improvement at the same rate with the 2 types of pills versus people who don't do anything from the placebo effect.
So there are a whole bunch of reasons why somebody will get better when they take a dummy pill. Firstly, maybe they were going to get better anyway, right? Because a cold has a kind of natural history. They last 3, 4, 5 days. And anything you do when your symptoms are at their worst, if you wait
a few days, you'll get better.
If you wait a few days, you're going to get better anyway. So a lot of people, they'll get better, but they were going to get better anyway. But also there's the placebo effect, and the placebo effect isn't just about taking a dummy sugar pill. It's about your beliefs and expectations, and it's about the meaning of the treatment. And this has been demonstrated in a whole load of really fascinating studies comparing one kind of placebo against another. So we know, for example, that 4 sugar pills a day is better than 2 sugar pills a day at treating gastric ulcers, and that's an outrageous finding. We know from 3 different studies on 3 different types of pain that a saltwater injection is a more effective treatment for pain than a dummy sugar pill. And that's not because a saltwater injection or a dummy sugar pill are having any kind of physiological effect on your body. It's because an injection feels like a much more dramatic, a much more serious intervention. Yeah. We know that the colour of pills makes a difference. And of course, you know, the pharmaceutical industry knows that the colour of pills makes a difference. That's why Prozac is in reassuring blue and white capsules, while the really potent antibiotics come in bright red, angry capsules. And we know that what doctors believe makes a difference. We know that what doctors say to patients makes a difference. We know that the characteristics of the room, whether it's nice or horrible, makes a difference. So the placebo effect is incredibly powerful and also incredibly interesting. And it is the real scientific story of the relationship between the mind and the body. And you don't have to invoke any kind of quantum nonsense or crystal healing to have mind-body healing. You know, it's right there in front of you in the extraordinary research into the placebo effect. What you get arising from that, though, I think is quite an interesting ethical question for medicine, which is people will say, not unreasonably, well, if you know, so homeopathy sugar pills don't work any better than placebo. Fine. You know, I've looked at the trials, and you're right, that's true. But what's so bad about giving people a placebo? And I think that's a really interesting question. You know, I think it raises serious ethical issues. I think for doctors in particular, the line is, not unreasonably, you know, we respect our patients' autonomy and informed consent. And we think that implicitly, I guess, is actually more important than whether or not patients get better. We will tolerate reduced efficacy in order to not lie to patients, in order to not mislead them by telling them that we're giving them an effective treatment when actually we're not. And that's a really kind of strange and interesting and arguable decision that the medical profession has made over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's quite new too, you know. The you know, communication skills training, such as it was in my, you know, when people of our parents' generation were going to medical school, was kind of how not to tell your patient that they're dying of cancer. Whereas now, you know, we teach our students how to work collaboratively with the patient towards an optimum health outcome. That is a straight quote from the piece of A4 we hand over to them.
Well, an optimum health outcome is, it's better. There's an improvement there, I guess. I think the question is, you know, if you're going to prescribe a placebo, you know, is it for something that this will help them feel a little bit better for a little while? You know, does somebody have a terminal disease? What are you working with? And, you know, what is the individual case of the patient? You know, this is not necessarily something that you can just blanket, you know, out there. Say, you know, if somebody wants to go to the pharmacy and get a homeopathic cold treatment to treat the cold or the sinus infection that could last a week to 2 or 3 weeks, it's not hurting them. But when there's something that taking a homeopathic or a placebo treatment would actually could lead to irreparable harm, that's where the switch gets flipped.
So that's interesting, because I think actually I think there are harms from homeopathy, even when it's not a direct harm. So there's obvious direct harms when, you know, homeopaths get kind of aggrandized by the fact that they're flattered or not criticized in mainstream media, which was certainly the case in the UK. I mean, yeah. They had absolute full spectrum dominance in mainstream media in the UK until kind of 5 years ago, I suppose. And I think they kind of got aggrandized by that. They get carried away. In the UK, the NHS, the National Health Service, will pay for homeopathy, which is absolutely bizarre, really. And so they're aggrandized by this, they're flattered by it, and they get carried away and they go too far. So in the UK, time and time again, undercover journalists have gone to homeopathy clinics and said, look, I'm going to a high-risk malaria area, and I don't want to take anti-malarials. What do you think I should do? And over and over again, homeopaths will say, oh, I can give you this homeopathy sugar pill that will prevent malaria, which is obviously, ridiculously, foolishly dangerous. It's murderously dangerous.
Yes.
I mean, actually, one of the most interesting things about all of these undercover stings, which doesn't get talked about so much, is not just that they're saying, here, have the pill, but also what they don't say, because alternative therapists talk in superficial branding terms about being holistic, about treating the whole patient. And to me, that's about doing something other than, outside of the pill. And if you went to a doctor and said, look, I'm worried about taking anti-malaria drugs because I'm worried about the side effects, then the doctor would say to you, well, that's fine, but here's some basic bite prevention advice. Don't sleep naked next to a marsh. Cover up as much as you can. Yeah. Use an impregnated net and check it for mosquitoes before you get in, and use bite repeller cream and stuff. That is, to me, what holistic medicine is all about. It's about the stuff that's outside of the pill, and that's a really big and important part of medicine, and that is what doctors do. It's what nurses and physiotherapists and everybody else does. Yeah, sure. Everybody knows somebody who's had a crappy experience with a doctor, but that's kind of a different problem.
Yeah.
Another example of how there's a disparity between the kind of the marketing fantasy and the reality, because they're obviously not treating people holistically if they're not giving them basic, like absolute basic first year bite prevention advice on how to prevent malaria. So that's kind of one example of how quacks can be dangerous. I guess you also have the risk of missed diagnoses if people start trusting in quacks too much. But also, I think there's a real serious problem of just poisoning the well. I think it's really, really sad and bizarre and strange, and certainly noteworthy, if you're living in a society where people say things that aren't true in national newspapers and go unchallenged, And so this is an interesting difference, actually, between the UK and America. I've gone to America loads over the last 2 years, and I absolutely adore you all. You're like,
everyone.
No, genuine. No, seriously, because everyone's so sort of ambitious and enthusiastic and polite and positive, and you're just really on the case. Everybody in England is very lackadaisical, and that's enjoyable too, but it gets a bit wearing. But there are really interesting differences between your media and ours. In the UK, our newspapers routinely make stuff up. It's really, really interesting, and it's very difficult, I think, for Americans to get their head around. You have, I guess, you have magazines like, or newspapers like National Enquirer, right? That's kind of known for publishing things which are a bit crazy, right?
Yes.
Is that right? Am I remembering that?
Yeah.
But that's not regarded as like a serious newspaper. But in the UK, every single serious newspaper you can think of routinely prints things that are demonstrably untrue, which they've copied and pasted from a press release from someone, or they just sort of transcribed from a source somewhere where they don't check it and they just stick it in. And that's really weird. That's weird for Americans, and I think it should be weirder to English people. And I think it's a function of how competitive a market is, because in the UK we have 10 national newspapers all competing in what is realistically, a small and increasingly forgotten country at the edge of the world. Whereas in America, you don't really have any national newspapers, and even the ones that do sell nationally, there aren't as many as that, and you've got a population 5 times as big. But what's interesting to me is your television is hugely overcrowded, and it's completely bonkers. Whereas our television we have very, very few channels. Like, we only had 5 channels until a couple of years ago in the UK.
And most of them are managed by the government, right?
They are. Only an American could say that. Most of them are managed by the government. Yeah. Do you have a basement full of baked beans and rifles, Kiki?
I do.
Genuine. Do you?
No.
No, because it's very difficult for me to gauge whether you're being serious. Because I know that, you don't do sarcasm or anything because you're American. So you actually have a basement full of baked beans and rifles.
I'll let you believe that. That's fine. Yeah.
Nice. So that's awesome. And that was weirdly hot as well, actually. So that's a kind of big difference between America and England. Is our newspapers routinely print things which they know full well are completely untrue.
Talking about the things that doctors should be doing, that homeopathic physicians should be doing as well, in terms of giving proper medical advice, giving advice that will actually help somebody, as opposed to just saying, "Here, take this sugar pill; it'll make you feel better." Is there a role?
Homeopaths giving pills at all, I think, is really kind of fascinating in some respects, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really interesting how the sort of hoops that they've gone through to sort of ape the superficial form of medicine. The fact that you have to take these pills, 3 in the morning and 3 at night. Why is it that something that works through the memory of water or whatever it is that they're claiming this week? Isn't it remarkable that you still have to take the pills, in the morning and in the evening, or just in the morning or whatever, in the same way that you would with normal medical treatments? To me, it's like they've sort of aped the superficial form of medicine, but without the content. It's like the Richard Feynman stories about the cargo cults. You know this story, right? Where so the cargo cults happened it was in Vanuatu, Pacific Island, and you, the Americans, that's personified for this evening by you, Kiki,
yes.
Arrived on this island and started bringing in loads of cargo, and all this cargo would arrive on the planes that flew into the airport. And then the war finished, and then the occupation finished, and then the Americans all disappeared, and the airstrip was left barren. And the people from the island were like freaked out and disappointed and annoyed, and started trying to recreate the conditions necessary for the cargo to come again. So the cargo carts set up, they would light fires along the edge of the runway as if they were landing lights. And a guy would sit in a sort of improvised wooden cabin like an air traffic control tower with a wooden box and a piece of string connected to a wooden microphone that he would bark instructions into. And they would perform these elaborate rituals that had the superficial form of air traffic control in the hope that the cargo would come again. But of course it never did. And that's how I see a lot of pseudoscience and alternative therapies, and I guess homeopathy in particular. Actually, weirdly enough, there's a guy called Mike J, who's one of the greatest writers in the universe, who writes about a lot of this kind of stuff. And he reckons that actually the cargo cult story might be a bit more complicated than that the people in Vanuatu were kind of pranksters as well, because the French tried to occupy them and were just really frustrated. They do things like try and buy them off, and they give them there was one time they gave them a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of gold, and they went back the next day and they found the islanders of Vanuatu just having this big ceremony where they just threw all the gold off this massive cliff at the edge of the island. And the French went, "What are you doing? This is gold." And they just all smiled and laughed and chanted. There was always another layer somewhere.
I think that the story, though, of the cargo cult, it gets at the question of why we believe these crazy things, which is also a chapter in your book. What is it that, even though we might see evidence to the contrary, even though we might, hear stories that people, see books like yours, people questioning and being skeptical. Why do we believe? Why do we go out and praise chant to the cargo cults, the cargo gods, I guess?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, we sort of we talked earlier about the kind of cultural issues and the trust and distrust of government or distrust of big corporations or whatever. But there's also just the very basic phenomenon of how bad we are at spotting random patterns and connections, or rather how good we are, because our brains have evolved to be very good at spotting patterns and causal relationships. Yes. But to do that, we've done it through a series of shortcuts. And in the same way that our perceptual system uses shortcuts to work out the three-dimensional space from the two-dimensional surface of our retina. So you use things like perspective to work out where something is relative to something else, and something's further away than something else. In the same way that we've developed shortcuts for perceptual cues, which can be gamed by optical illusions, we've also developed shortcuts for reasoning around causal relationships, and those can be gamed. And you can have what I think are sort of best described, I suppose, as cognitive illusions. And I mean, this goes right down to the absolute core before you get to, what does a pattern mean, or is one thing associated with something else? We're actually very bad, even at the most basic, simple, straightforward thing of, is there a pattern to be explained here at all? So there's a load of research into whether we're able to identify patterns in random data. So if you take a series of X's and zeros, like as if you tossed a coin, completely random, if you sit people down and you say, okay, we're looking at the phenomenon of people getting their eye in during a sports game. So this is whether or not somebody's managed to hit a home run. And you can see an X means they've hit a home run and a 0 means they haven't. And you sit people down and you go, okay, so talk me through what's happening for the batter here in this game. They will tell you a long and elaborate story. They'll be like, oh, well, you can see here he's really got his eye in. He's hit 4 in a row. He's doing really well. And then he's kind of on and off. He's patchy, and then he's lost it. He's completely lost it. There's just a bunch of misses all in a row with a couple of hits interspersed, but mainly he's just gone horribly wrong. People will imagine that there are patterns even in completely random strips of X's and zeros, because we expect that random data should have more alternation than it really does. But on top of that, we are also just very, very bad at spotting whether there is a true relationship between a cause and effect. The first thing that happens, we give greater primacy to, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we're not primed to immediately start, assessing the statistical nature of something. It's more like you said, our brain is a great pattern recognizer. That's what we're good at doing. But in terms of actually figuring out the probability, the statistics, doing a t-test on a couple of samples in real life, in your daily life, that's not going to happen. And additionally, at least I know here in the United States, people aren't really trained in statistics, even just to analyze statistics that are given to them in the media, to be able to tell whether or not they're good statistics or whether or not they're statistics being used for a particular purpose, statistic numbers that are being manipulated. There was a really interesting report recently about a psychological study looking into the paranormal. What is it? Not mind reading, but basically being able to predict the future. That being able to sense what people were going to say or what images were going to be popping up on a screen. And this study is like, I think it was a paper that was published. It was like a combination of something like 7 or 8 or maybe 9 separate studies. Lots of students over several years at a university were involved in these studies, so pretty big sample sizes. But at the end, they came out with what they say is a significant result. It's a slightly significant result, yet they have no way of explaining why it happened. And the conversation that has come out of this paper being published is that people in the social sciences and psychology and these studies into paranormal activity or like distance healing or other medical effects, is that the statistical tests that they're doing are not actually appropriate and might be giving them significance where there is none. And so even the tests that the scientists are using may not be, appropriate all the time.
Yeah, I've not read that paper. I skimmed through the abstract very quickly, and I know that people have been jumping up and down and shouting about it.
Yeah, a lot of hand waving.
I guess, it raises a couple of interesting statistical issues, firstly. So there's a whole school of stats called Bayesian Statistics, where you take into account, I guess, really the pre-test probability of something actually being true or not. So it's basically a way of formalizing the aphorism, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is, or rather, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I think it's reasonable to say that for evidence of precognition, then you would probably require more than just a couple of studies reaching, significance of p equals 0.05. But also, these are often complex technical issues where I'm not going to get too upset about the idea that the general public won't be able to critically appraise the stats in that paper,
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's quite a good example of people fighting stuff out in academia. Actually, the great tragedy really of that is that the fights so commonly happen behind academic paywalls, where nobody outside of an institution with a library subscription can afford to read the papers and go through them. But I think, I'm all in favour actually of really dreadful research being published as well. I think that's a really good thing. I think we should publish everything and then criticise it afterwards. There was a great a 2-page sort of journalistic feature in Nature on this just last week about the kind of publish and be damned model of academic publishing, which I think is really important and interesting. Actually, they've just taken a letter from me in response, which is very exciting.
Yeah, you published something in the Guardian on this topic. Did you write something about the academic publishing?
Yes, about 1,000 times. I posted something today on bengoldacre.posterous.com. But also, if people want to read my stuff, I should have been more American about this. It's all at badscience.net. Everything I've ever written, like 500,000 words. The book is nice because you can take it to the loo and it's portable. I'm not, when I say take it to the loo, well, you can do whatever you like.
You can do what you like with it once you buy it.
Exactly. Actually, my preferred deployment, if you buy it, is give it as a sort of weapon of war. Find the person who disagrees with you the most. See if you can sort of start arguments in your family home. Find somebody who thinks vaccines are dreadful and give them the book. But if you go to Bad Science on it, basically everything I've ever written is there, and it's free, and it's about 500,000 words, which will keep you going for a while.
So in addition to your website, badscience.net, you write at The Guardian in a column called Bad Science. You've written the book Bad Science. I've also seen news, it was on your blog, actually, on your website, that you're going to be doing this awesome, massive nerd tour.
Yeah. So I'm pretty down on mainstream sort of controlled push media, like kind of television and stuff. Science on television, especially in the UK, is often very kind of dumbed down. So me and a very good friend of mine called Robin Ince, who's a comedian, have been doing loads of stuff together. He's really the kind of linchpin, where we, first of all, he was sort of started organising these comedy nights that were really great, where he would get in a bunch of comedians and a couple of musicians and a couple of sort of academic nerdy people like me or D-list public intellectuals like me, and we'd have this kind of gang show thing where we would all do 20 minutes or whatever of our shtick. And then it kind of got out of hand, and we started doing them. We did them at in the Bloomsbury Theatre in central London, which holds about 1,000 people. And we're going to do one, and then that sold out before we advertised it. And then we didn't sort of put another few on, and it sold out 7 nights in a row, I think. So then we booked the Hammersmith Apollo, which holds about 4,000 people. And that sold out. And because that sold out, we had enough money to have a full orchestra to play everyone on and off stage. It was basically this infantile nerd fantasy come true. I appeared wearing a tank top to the sound of the Doctor Who theme tune being played by a 40-piece orchestra. It was amazing.
Awesome.
So this sort of all got slightly out of hand, and we sort of carried on doing it. We do a kind of, we go through, we do sort of festivals and stuff. We sort of take over a whole tent for a day at a festival and that sort of stuff. And now we're doing this tour, because I've done zillions and zillions of talks sort of in universities and schools and stuff for free, which is great, except it's a real hassle to organise, because you then have to fill out all of these forms to get your train fare back, and I never do, so I just lose lots of money. But somebody offered to organise like a proper tour with competent admin staff and pre-booked travel. And so we're doing that, and it's me and it's Robin Ince and Simon Singh, who's a great science writer and nerd, and Brian Cox, who's a physicist and nerd. And it's really bizarre. People are actually buying tickets for this travelling sort of nerd parade of us giving talks, which will be a little bit funny. And there are lots of there are bits of this on the web already. So if you go to badscience.net and look for the awesome Massive Nerd Tour thing, there's a clip of one of our previous shows, which was on the BBC and stuff. So it's good, and we get musicians and things. We have Robin Hitchcock a lot; he's great. And we had Jarvis Cocker, which was actually slightly strange and alienating, because just sort of standing backstage, chatting to Jarvis Cocker, wearing corduroy trousers and a shirt and a woolen tank top and a tweed jacket. And then you suddenly think, does Jarvis Cocker look at guys like me and just think, I invented that, and now look what you've done.
I invented that in a, one of my albums.
1995. So, so it's a great opportunity for me to feel slightly self-conscious around people who are very famous. But also it's a great opportunity for people to see like unedited nerds talking about the stuff that they're really excited about, which is great. Like, they're really, really good, fun shows. And we pack in like 15 or 20 people on some nights. So this tour that we're doing is like 3 or 4 of us in a night. But for the big kind of gang show things, everybody gets a 7-minute slot. And they're just amazing, you know. Stuart Lee, everyone. It's a galaxy of stars. Maybe English stars you've never heard of. Barry Cryer. Barry Cryer. Forgot. Who would you have heard of in America?
It sounds like fun. Jarvis Cocker, Robin Hitchcock. I'm well aware. And your names,
Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins.
Okay.
The Dorkbot. Who else? Yeah, very good fun. If anybody would like us to come to America, we're already available for weddings and engagements and bar mitzvahs and stuff.
Excellent. Well, maybe we can combine your nerd stock with our American woot stock, which is a very similar kind of gig. Some
that's
Will
true.
Wheaton and others. I think Phil Plait, the Bad Astronomer, has been one of the people involved in that. Paul and Storm, who are their kind of geek song comedians. Anyway, very similar. A combining of the forces. You could have the American versus the British geek nerd battle.
I really love how. It's really interesting to me how there's been this, especially with the kind of organizing power of the internet, there's been this explosion in genuine, real sort of grassroots nerd, sort of popular nerd public activities. Like there's the Skeptics in the Pub movement in England, which I think you have in parts of America as well.
Yeah.
Which, it's not even restricted to the skeptic thing. I mean, I don't care about people who believe in ghosts or psychics or any of that. It's kind of turned into this just amazing kind of, get a scientist or an academic or a good blogger along and get them to give a talk. And sometimes they're great and sometimes they're a bit chaotic, but also it's just sort of brilliantly forgiving. Sometimes people are really funny. Sometimes people aren't polished, but they're just really good. And that's sort of almost better, and yeah, I not a day goes by that I don't just sit at my computer and think how incredibly grateful I am that I live in a time when I just have constant self-edited access to awesome stuff.
I can totally appreciate that as well. I'm going to let you get to bed. We have to...
Thanks.
You're welcome. We have another show coming up in a little bit here. This has been fabulous, Ben. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been a lot of fun talking with you and having a surprise caller, help us out with the show a little bit today. That was fun.
That was great. Yeah, Baha. Nice to have his Skype details. I'll be badgering him over the next few days.
Excellent.
At regular intervals.
We will continue the fun. Anyone who is interested in finding out more about Bad Science, the book by Ben Goldacre, you can go, as has been mentioned before, to his website, badscience.net. There's information there, links to be able to find the book online, to be able to get yourself a copy if that's what you're interested in. Also, as Ben said, archive of everything he's written going back years and years and years. So you have a lot of material to peruse if this show was not quite enough for you. Additionally, this show will be... This show will probably be up in a day or so. You can find past episodes of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour at twit.tv/Kiki. That's Kiki. And you can find me online as Dr. Kiki. Ben, you also have a Twitter account. Is it at Ben Goldacre?
Yes, Ben Goldacre. You can also follow my cat. My dead cat, Hetty, is a nutritionist. She's at Cat Nutritionist, and I'm Ben Goldacre.
Excellent. So some options there for following Ben on Twitter using that social media thing that we all know and love. Next week on Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, we will be talking with Brian Switek from Wired.com. He's a blogger. He has a blog, Laylaps, on the Wired website, and he covers paleontology. So we're going to be talking about dinosaurs, evolution, and paleontology, and lots of fun stuff there, talking about the incredibly shrinking organisms and, how fun stuff happens in evolution that just confuses us in the fossil record sometimes. How exciting can that be? I think that's about it. So thank you, everybody, for joining me and Ben Goldacre today. This has been a lot of fun. Let's let Ben get some sleep. Let's move it forward on the Twit network. Until next week, I'm Dr. Kiki. If nothing else, I hope this hour plus of programming made your world a whole lot more interesting.